Long after the fall of Smaug and the restoration of the kingdom beneath the mountain, when the halls of Erebor once more rang with hammer song and laughter, there lived among Durin's folk an old dwarf named Balin, son of Fundin. Age had silvered his beard, but it had not dimmed the brightness of his eyes. Those who looked upon him saw at once a dwarf of great renown, one who had crossed wild lands beside Thorin Oakenshield, endured hardship and exile, and stood witness to deeds that were already passing into legend. Young dwarves listened eagerly whenever he spoke of the quest of Erebor, while the older folk treated him with a respect usually reserved for kings and heroes. Yet despite the honor that surrounded him, Balin was not entirely at peace. For while Erebor flourished and the markets of Dale prospered beneath the protection of the mountain, there remained within his heart a longing that neither gold nor comfort could satisfy. In the quiet hours of evening, when the business of the day was done and the great halls grew still, his thoughts often wandered westward across leagues of forest and plain, beyond the Anduin and the Dimril Dale, to the shadowed roots of the Misty Mountains. There lay Khazad-dûm. To men it was Moria, a name spoken with caution and unease. To elves it was a memory from an older age of the world, filled with both wonder and sorrow. But to the dwarves, and especially to those descended from Durin the Deathless, it was something far greater. It was home, not merely a kingdom, nor a city carved from stone, but the birthplace of their greatness. It was there, in ages long forgotten by men, that Durin himself had awakened beside the still waters of Kheled-Zaram and founded the greatest realm the dwarves had ever known. Its halls had stretched for miles beneath the mountains. Its pillars had risen like mighty trees in a stone forest. Its mines had yielded mithril, the precious true silver for which kings would have traded entire kingdoms. Many evenings Balin sat beside the fire in a small chamber overlooking one of Erebor's lower halls. There, with a cup of dark ale untouched beside him, he would gaze into the flames and imagine the ancient kingdom as it had once been. He saw endless avenues lit by golden lamps. He heard the ringing of countless hammers. He pictured bridges arching over black chasms and stairways disappearing into the depths of the earth. Most of all, he imagined the voices of thousands of dwarves living, working, singing and thriving beneath the mountain. Then the vision would fade, the fire would settle, and he would once again find himself in Erebor, safe, prosperous, respected, yet restless. One winter evening, as snow drifted against the outer walls of the mountain and a cold wind prowled among the upper terraces, Balin sat, as he often did, beside a low-burning fire. Most of the kingdom had retired for the night. The forges were quiet. The taverns had emptied. Only the occasional sound of distant footsteps echoed through the halls. He had been staring into the flames for so long that he scarcely noticed the figure entering the chamber. "You are thinking of Moria again." The voice was familiar. Balin looked up and smiled. King Dane Ironfoot stood in the doorway. Though he wore neither crown nor armor, there was no mistaking him. His broad shoulders, stern features, and braided beard gave him the appearance of a warrior, even in times of peace. "Am I so easy to read?" Balin asked. Dine crossed the room and lowered himself into a chair opposite him. "To everyone else, perhaps not," he replied. "To me, yes." For a while neither dwarf spoke. The fire crackled softly between them, and beyond the thick stone walls the winter wind moaned like a distant horn. At last Dine sighed. "You still mean to go?" It was not a question. Balin nodded. "Aye." The king studied him carefully. "You know what lies there." "Do I? You know enough." A faint smile touched Balin's face. "Perhaps, yet I suspect there is much that none of us know." "That may be precisely the problem." For a moment, Dain seemed reluctant to continue, but eventually he leaned forward, resting his elbows upon his knees. "Do you remember Azanul-Bizar?" Balin's expression darkened. Every dwarf remembered Azanul-Bizar. The Battle of Nanduhirion, the valley before the east gate of Moria, where thousands of dwarves and orcs had slain one another in a single terrible day. "I remember," he said quietly. "I was young then," said Dain. "Too young, perhaps. Young enough to believe courage could overcome any danger." Balin said nothing. He had heard fragments of this story before. But when the battle was over, Dain continued, many wished to enter Khazad-dûm. They believed the way had been won. "You did not?" "No." The king stared into the fire. For a long time he remained silent. When he spoke again, his voice was scarcely more than a whisper. "I looked through the gate. The flames shifted. Shadows moved upon the walls. And..." Dain's jaw tightened. "I saw something." "What?" "I do not know." Balin frowned. "A creature? Perhaps. A shadow? Perhaps." The king shook his head slowly. "I only know that the darkness beyond the gate did not feel empty. It felt aware, as though something ancient had turned its gaze upon me." The room seemed colder. Even now, decades later, the memory troubled him. "I felt fear, Balin." Those words hung in the air, not concern, not caution. Fear. Coming from Dane Ironfoot, they carried considerable weight. Yet Balin merely looked back into the fire. "And still," he said softly, "I dream of it." Dain closed his eyes, for that was the heart of the matter. He understood the longing. Every dwarf did. Khazad-dûm was not merely stone and treasure. It was inheritance, memory, pride, the greatest achievement of their people. Its loss had become a wound carried by generations. "It is ours," Balin said at last. "Aye, and it remains in darkness." "Aye. Should that not trouble us?" The king laughed quietly. "It troubles me greatly." "Then perhaps it is time someone did something about it." Dain shook his head. "You have always been stubborn, and you have always been cautious. One of those qualities keeps dwarves alive." "Which one?" "That depends entirely on who survives long enough to write the story." For the first time that evening, Balin laughed aloud. And yet beneath the humour, both dwarves understood that the decision had already been made. The dream that had lived within Balin for so many years was no longer merely a dream. Soon it would become a journey. And beyond that journey lay Khazad-dûm itself. Waiting in darkness beneath the mountains. Chapter 2. The long road west. The decision, once made, spread through Erebor like a spark through dry tinder. At first, there had been only whispers in quiet corners of the mountain. Balin was studying old maps. Balin had spoken privately with the king. Balin had been asking questions about the roads west and the condition of the old dwarf settlements beyond the Anduin. Before long, however, whispers became certainty. Balin, son of Fundin, intended to return to Khazad-dûm. Some called it brave, others called it madness. Most, if they were honest, called it both. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Supplies were gathered from storehouses. Armor was inspected. Axes were sharpened. Old records were searched for any scrap of knowledge concerning Moria's forgotten halls. Messengers rode between Erebor and Dale, carrying requests for provisions and information. And as the preparations continued, volunteers began to arrive. The first was Oin. Though age had bent his shoulders slightly and diminished his hearing, his spirit remained as fierce as ever. He arrived carrying a collection of medicines, tools, and travelling gear, placing them heavily upon Balin's table. "You will need someone sensible," he declared. Balin looked at the mountain of equipment and raised an eyebrow. "Then why have you come?" Oin snorted. "To ensure your foolishness does not kill everyone else." Balin laughed. It was the answer he had expected. Ori came next. Unlike many dwarves, Ori possessed a quiet nature. He preferred books to boasts and records to arguments. Under one arm, he carried a large leather-bound volume, its pages still blank. "You intend to write our story?" Balin asked. "I intend to write whatever happens," Ori replied. "And if nothing worth writing happens..." Ori smiled. "Then it will be a very short book." Others followed. Floy, broad-shouldered and loud-voiced. Fra, whose skill with stone was renowned throughout Erebor. Lonnie, Nali, and many more. Some were warriors, some were miners, some were craftsmen. A few were little more than young dwarves seeking adventure. Yet all carried the same dream: Khazad-dûm. By the time spring arrived, the company had grown to a respectable size. Not an army, not nearly enough to conquer a kingdom by force, but large enough to establish a foothold. Large enough, perhaps, to awaken old hopes. The morning of departure dawned cold and clear. The gates of Erebor stood open. Beyond them, the first light of day touched the slopes of the mountain and turned the snow upon distant peaks to gold. A great crowd had gathered: families, friends, merchants, craftsmen. Children perched upon walls and stairways to catch a glimpse of the departing company. There were embraces. There were farewells. There were promises to return. Some spoken with confidence, others spoken with less certainty. Balin stood quietly among his companions, looking out across the assembled crowd. For the first time, the true weight of his decision settled upon him. These dwarves were not following a dream. They were following him. Their lives now rested, in part, upon his judgment. The thought sobered him. At length, King Dain appeared. A hush fell over the gathering. The king approached without ceremony, carrying something wrapped carefully in dark cloth. When he stopped before Balin, he slowly unfolded it. Within lay a silver lamp, small enough to carry in one hand, beautifully crafted, ancient. Its polished surface was covered in delicate runes and patterns worked by a master craftsman long ago. "This belonged to my father," Dain said. Balin accepted it with both hands. The metal felt strangely warm despite the morning chill. "When should I light it?" he asked. Dain looked westward, toward lands hidden beyond sight, "when you find a hall worthy of it." For a moment neither dwarf spoke. Then Dain embraced him, not as a king embraces a subject, but as one old friend embraces another before a long journey. "Go carefully," he said quietly. "I will. And if you find only darkness..." Balin looked down at the lamp, then toward the road. "At least the darkness will know we came." Dain smiled sadly. A very dwarf answer. Then the horns of Erebor sounded, deep, slow, solemn, and the company departed. The road carried them south and west. At first they travelled through familiar lands. The broad valley beneath the lonely mountain was alive with spring. Fields around Dale showed the first signs of new growth. Farmers worked beneath clear skies. Traders moved along well-maintained roads. People paused to watch the company pass. Many recognized Balin. Some cheered. Others simply nodded respectfully. As the days passed, the comforts of civilization slowly faded behind them. The roads became rougher. Villages became fewer. The wilderness grew larger. Each evening they made camp beneath the open sky. And each evening the stories began. Dwarves are natural storytellers. Perhaps it comes from generations spent beneath mountains, gathered around hearths while storms raged beyond stone walls. Whatever the reason, every campfire seemed to awaken old tales. Stories of ancient kings, stories of dragons, stories of treasure, stories of foolish goblins and clever dwarves. Evenings that began quietly often ended with laughter echoing through the darkness. One night, while camped beside a stream, Floy launched into a particularly outrageous account of a cave troll he claimed to have fought single-handedly. The creature grew larger with each retelling. By the end of the story, it was nearly the size of a mountain. I distinctly remember there being 3 trolls. Oin interrupted. Floy frowned. There were. And Thorin helped. A little. And the troll slipped on wet rocks. Possibly. And you spent most of the fight hiding behind a tree. The camp erupted with laughter. Floy threw a pine cone at him. Ori quietly recorded the entire exchange. Do not write that down, Floy warned. I already have, Ori replied. The company travelled onward. Weeks passed. The landscape slowly changed. The great forests of Wilderland surrounded them. Towering pines stretched toward the heavens. Ancient oaks cast vast shadows across the forest floor. Birdsong filled the mornings. At night, strange cries echoed among distant trees. Occasionally, they encountered travellers, woodmen, hunters, merchants. A few recognized Balin and wished the company well. Others looked puzzled when they learned their destination. More than one traveller questioned their sanity. One elderly woodsman merely shook his head. Moria, he muttered. I thought sensible folk avoided that place. We are dwarves, said Floy. The woodsman considered this. That explains quite a lot. As spring deepened, the weather improved. The days grew warmer. Wildflowers appeared beside the road. Streams swelled with snowmelt from distant mountains. Yet even during these pleasant days, the western horizon increasingly drew their attention. The Misty Mountains. At first, they appeared only as faint shadows, a distant line beneath the clouds. But with each passing day they grew larger, clearer, more imposing. Soon individual peaks could be distinguished. Great jagged summits crowned with snow. Dark valleys hidden between towering ridges. Sheer cliffs that seemed to rise directly into the sky. Even the most talkative dwarves became quieter as the mountains approached. For beyond those peaks waited their destination. Beyond those peaks waited Khazad-dûm. One evening, Balin sat alone beside the campfire, studying the western horizon. The mountains were visible even in twilight, great black shapes against a fading sky. Ori approached quietly and sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. At last, Ori broke the silence. What do you think it will be like? Balin smiled faintly. When we arrive? Ori nodded. The older dwarf considered the question. I think it will be larger than any of us expect. Ori laughed softly. That seems likely. And quieter. The younger dwarf glanced at him. Quieter? Balin stared into the fire. I have spent my whole life hearing stories about Khazad-dûm. He paused. I think silence will be the hardest thing. The following morning, they resumed their journey. The land rose steadily. Forests gave way to rocky slopes. Streams became swift mountain rivers. The air grew cooler. At last, they entered the Dimril Dale. The valley lay beneath towering peaks. Steep walls of stone rose on either side. The sound of rushing water echoed from every direction. The company moved carefully now. Conversation had almost vanished. The mountains seemed to demand silence. Late that afternoon they saw it. The Mirrormere. Keled Zarum, the sacred lake of Durin. Its waters lay perfectly still. So still that the mountains reflected upon its surface with flawless clarity. Sky and stone seemed suspended together within its depths. The company halted. No command had been given. No order was needed. Every dwarf understood where they stood. This was the place where, according to ancient legend, Durin the Deathless had first gazed into the water and seen a crown of stars reflected above his head. The place where the greatest story of their people had begun. Balin slowly approached the shoreline. The lake remained undisturbed. The reflection of the mountains shimmered softly. For a long while, he simply stood there. Then he knelt and touched the water. It was cold. Colder than melted snow. Colder than ice, yet strangely comforting. As though the lake remembered. As though it had watched generations come and go. As though it had been waiting. The company made camp beside the Mirrormere that night. Few slept deeply. The mountains loomed above them. And somewhere beyond the valley lay the East Gate, the entrance to Khazad-dûm, their goal, their dream, their inheritance. At dawn they rose. No songs were sung that morning. No jokes were shared. Even Floy seemed subdued. The path climbed steadily through broken stone and ancient ruins. Signs of old battles appeared here and there. Fragments of rusted armor, weather-worn carvings, collapsed walls, ghosts of a forgotten age. Then, shortly before midday, they rounded a bend and stopped. There it was, the East Gate of Moria, the ancient entrance to Khazad-dûm. Even in ruin, it inspired awe. The great doors were broken, the carvings worn by time. Yet the sheer scale of the gate remained overwhelming. It seemed less a doorway than a wound cut into the mountain itself. Beyond it lay darkness, deep, silent, unmoving. No sound emerged, no light could be seen, only blackness. The company stood motionless. Nobody spoke. At last, Balin stepped forward alone. His boots echoed softly against ancient stone. Slowly, he approached the gate. Every step carried him closer to the dream that had filled his thoughts for so many years. At last, he reached the entrance. He placed one hand upon the cold stone. For a moment, he closed his eyes. Then he opened them once more and looked into the darkness. When he spoke, his voice was little more than a whisper. Yet every dwarf heard it. We have come home. And with those words, Balin, son of Fundin, crossed the threshold into Khazad-dûm. Chapter 3. The First Light Returns. For a moment after Balin crossed the threshold, nobody moved. The darkness beyond the east gate seemed almost alive. It hung before them like a curtain woven from shadow and silence. Even the mountain air felt different here. The breeze that had followed them through the Dimril Dale died away at the entrance, as though unwilling to venture further. Behind them lay sunlight. Before them lay Moria. At last, Balin raised his lantern. The flame cast a trembling glow across ancient stone. "Torches," he said quietly. One by one, lights flared to life throughout the company. Orange flames pushed back the darkness, revealing fragments of walls, broken carvings, and stretches of floor buried beneath centuries of dust. Then Balin took another step, and another. The company followed. The sound of their boots echoed through the vastness ahead. Each footfall seemed to awaken 100 more. The noise travelled into unseen chambers and distant corridors before returning as faint whispers. The effect unsettled many of the younger dwarves. Several glanced nervously over their shoulders. Floy broke the silence. "If every step echoes like this, we shall never sneak up on anything." A few dwarves chuckled. The tension eased, slightly. Yet the darkness remained. The first halls they entered were ruined. Many bore the scars of old battles. Broken spear shafts lay scattered among the dust. Fragments of rusted mail rested against walls. In one chamber, they discovered the remains of a barricade, long collapsed beneath its own age. Nearby lay bones, orc bones, dwarf bones. Time had reduced them all to pale fragments. No one could tell friend from foe. Balin ordered them gathered and buried beneath carefully stacked stones. "No dwarf of Durin's line shall lie forgotten," he said. The company worked in silence. When the task was complete, they continued deeper. The scale of Moria quickly became apparent. Every corridor seemed larger than expected. Every chamber opened into another chamber. Every stairway led to further levels hidden within the mountain. Again and again, the dwarves found themselves stopping simply to stare. Even in decay, Khazad-dûm remained magnificent. They passed beneath arches taller than any building in Dale. They walked through galleries lined with carvings worn smooth by centuries. They crossed bridges spanning dark cracks in the earth where torchlight could not find the bottom. Ori spent much of the journey writing. His journal grew heavier with each passing day. Descriptions, measurements, sketches, observations, names, anything that might preserve the memory of what they found. "At this rate," Floy observed one evening, "your book will weigh more than your axe." Ori smiled. "My axe cannot remember anything." For 3 days they explored the eastern halls. No enemies appeared. No drums echoed from the depths. No signs of recent occupation revealed themselves. The silence grew stranger with every passing hour. Many had expected danger. Instead, they found emptiness, an emptiness so vast it became unsettling. At night, they camped within cleared chambers near the entrance. Watches were maintained, fires were kept burning, yet nothing disturbed them, not even the sound of distant movement. It was as though the mountain itself slept. On the 4th day, they discovered a great corridor leading westward. Unlike many of the ruined passages they had explored thus far, this one remained largely intact. Its walls were smooth and unbroken. Ancient lamps still hung from iron brackets. Though long extinguished, they seemed to wait patiently for flame. Balin examined the stonework closely. This was once an important way. Fra nodded. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Indeed it was. The corridor stretched forward like a road through darkness. Its ceiling vanished beyond the reach of torchlight. Its polished floor remained remarkably level despite centuries of abandonment. The dwarves advanced carefully. The further they travelled, the stronger a curious feeling grew among them. It was difficult to describe, a sense of presence, not the presence of danger, nor of enemies, rather the lingering memory of countless lives once lived here. Many found themselves lowering their voices. Others removed their helmets. It felt less like exploring a ruin and more like entering a sacred place. At last, the corridor widened. The company emerged into a space so immense that every dwarf stopped where he stood. No one spoke. No one moved. The sight before them stole every word. The hall stretched farther than their torches could illuminate. Rows of enormous pillars marched away into darkness like a forest of stone. Their surfaces were smooth and polished, their bases broader than houses. Far above, invisible ceilings swallowed the light entirely. The chamber was vast, beyond comprehension. Balin felt his breath catch. Even after years of imagining Khazad-dûm, reality exceeded every dream. Floy slowly removed his helmet. By dwarf standards, this was an act bordering on reverence. "By Durin," he whispered. The words echoed softly. "By Durin, by Durin, by Durin," returning from distant reaches of the hall. Ori stood frozen. His journal hung forgotten at his side. No amount of writing could adequately describe what stood before them. For the first time since entering Moria, Balin felt tears gathering in his eyes. Not from sorrow, not from fear, from wonder. "This is the 21st hall," Oin said quietly. Several dwarves turned toward him. "How do you know?" The old dwarf smiled. "I've seen drawings." He gestured upward, and no drawing ever did it justice. Slowly, the company spread throughout the chamber. Torches moved like tiny stars beneath colossal pillars. Everywhere they looked, signs of former greatness remained. Stone benches, carved walls, ancient inscriptions. Balconies overlooking lower levels. Doorways leading into further chambers. Many were damaged, many were covered in dust, yet enough remained to reveal the magnificence that had once existed here. At the center of the hall stood Balin. He reached into his pack. Carefully, he removed the silver lamp Dain had given him. The polished metal caught the torchlight. For a moment he simply held it, remembering the farewell, the king's warning, the long road west. Then he looked around the hall worthy of it. He had found it. "Bring me a flame." Oin stepped forward. His torch burned steadily. Without a word, he touched the flame to the lamp's wick. For a moment nothing happened. Then the silver lamp came alive. A warm golden light spread outward, gentle, steady, beautiful. The metal reflected the flame perfectly. Patterns danced across nearby pillars. Dust sparkled like tiny stars. Silence filled the hall. Then Balin raised the lamp. "For Durin," he said. "For Durin," echoed the company. "For our fathers. For our fathers. For Khazad-dûm. For Khazad-dûm." The words rolled through the vast chamber. Ancient stone carried them away into darkness, and for the first time in many centuries, a friendly light burned within Moria. No one gave the order. No one planned it. Yet slowly, almost instinctively, the dwarves began to sing. It started with a single voice, then another, then several more. The song was old, older than Erebor, older than Smaug, older than memory itself. A song of stone, a song of craft, a song of the deep places beneath the mountains. Their voices rose together, strong, steady, proud. The sound travelled through the hall and returned magnified 100-fold. For a moment, it seemed as though unseen singers answered from the darkness, as though the mountain itself remembered. Many dwarves wept openly. Others simply stood with heads bowed, listening, remembering, belonging. When the final notes faded, no one spoke for several minutes. Words seemed inadequate. Eventually, Balin broke the silence. "We stay." The statement required no discussion, no vote, no debate. Every dwarf already knew. This would be their first settlement, their first foothold, the beginning of everything. Work commenced immediately. Over the following weeks, the 21st Hall became the heart of their colony. Dust was cleared, broken stone removed, sleeping quarters established, storehouses organized, workshops created. Every day brought new discoveries, ancient records, forgotten chambers, hidden passages. Many yielded nothing of value. Others revealed treasures far greater than gold, knowledge, history, memory. Ori was particularly delighted whenever old inscriptions were uncovered. Several times he became so absorbed in studying ancient writing that others were forced to remind him to eat. One afternoon, while examining a weathered wall, he suddenly shouted. The sound startled half the hall. Balin hurried over. "What is it?" Ori pointed excitedly. "Names." "What names?" "The names of the craftsmen who built this section." Balin studied the inscription. The letters were faint, worn by centuries, yet still legible. Dwarves long dead, long forgotten. And yet their work remained. Their names remained. Their presence remained. The discovery affected everyone more deeply than expected. Suddenly, Khazad-dûm felt less like a ruin, and more like a home waiting to be reclaimed. As the weeks passed, confidence grew. Scouting parties ventured further. Additional halls were explored. Ancient workshops were reopened. Storehouses yielded useful supplies. Most importantly of all, no serious opposition appeared. Occasionally signs of old orc occupation were discovered, but no organized resistance emerged. No armies waited in the darkness. No hidden enemy challenged their presence. Slowly, a dangerous thought began taking root. Perhaps Moria truly was empty. Perhaps the fears of previous generations had been exaggerated. Perhaps the darkness had finally passed. One evening, as the company gathered around a newly constructed hearth, Floy voiced what many were thinking. "We may actually do it." Several dwarves nodded. "Do what?" asked Oin. "Reclaim the place." The old dwarf considered this. Then he glanced across the vast hall, at the lit lamps, at the repaired stonework, at the dwarves laughing and sharing food, at the silver lamp still burning near the center of the chamber. "Aye," he admitted, "we might." Nearby, Balin sat quietly listening. Hope filled him, a hope stronger than any he had felt in many years. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine success. Not survival, not merely exploration. Success, families returning, trade routes reopening, children growing up beneath these pillars, songs echoing once more throughout the kingdom of Durin. The dream no longer seemed impossible. The mountain felt alive again, and deep beneath the stone, far beyond the reach of torchlight and memory, something stirred. But none of them knew it. Not yet. For now, there was only light and hope, and the first fragile beginnings of a kingdom reborn. Chapter 4. Lord of Moria. Summer came slowly to the world above the mountains. Though no sunlight reached the 21st hall, the dwarves kept careful count of the passing days. Marks were cut into stone tablets. Records were maintained. Watches were rotated. Meals were shared according to a rhythm that brought order to life beneath the earth. And as the weeks became months, something remarkable began to happen. Moria began to live again. At first the changes were small. A repaired doorway, a cleared corridor, a workshop returned to use. A forgotten chamber reopened after centuries of silence, yet each success led to another. The dwarves worked tirelessly. Dust and rubble were hauled away. Collapsed walls were rebuilt. Ancient passages were secured. Storehouses were catalogued. Maps were expanded. Every day revealed new wonders. Every day deepened their belief that Khazad-dûm could truly be reclaimed. The 21st hall became the heart of the colony. Lanterns now hung from many of its pillars. Fresh banners bearing the emblem of Durin's folk were raised. Stone tables filled the center of the chamber. The sound of hammers once again echoed beneath its vast ceiling. At times, Balin would stand alone near the great eastern entrance to the hall and simply listen. The sounds were familiar, the scrape of tools, the ring of metal, voices carrying through distant passages, laughter, life. It was not yet the mighty kingdom of old, not even close, but it was alive, and that alone felt like a miracle. One evening, while workers shared a meal beneath the great pillars, Ori approached Balin carrying several sheets of parchment. "I thought you should see these." Balin accepted them. "What are they?" "Population records." Balin frowned. "Population records?" Ori nodded. "I've been keeping count." The older dwarf looked down. The numbers surprised him. Far more work had been accomplished than he realized. New chambers occupied, additional workshops established, food stores expanding, supply usage stabilizing. The colony was becoming organized, permanent, real. Ori smiled. "We are no longer merely an expedition." Balin looked around the hall. Perhaps for the first time, he realized the truth of those words. They were settlers now, builders, founders, not explorers. The distinction mattered, more than he had realized. Word was sent eastward. Messengers departed for Erebor carrying reports of their success. The roads remained difficult, but passable. Weeks later, the first replies returned. The news spread quickly through the colony. Erebor celebrated their progress. King Dain himself had expressed cautious approval. Additional supplies would be sent. More volunteers might follow in time. The announcement was greeted with cheers. Even Oin looked pleased, though he quickly attempted to hide it. "I suppose this means we are not dead yet," he grumbled. Floy laughed, a rare moment of optimism. "Do not get used to it." The colony continued to expand. Scouting parties ventured further west. Others explored upper levels that had remained untouched since the abandonment of Moria. Ancient workshops were rediscovered. Many still contained tools left exactly where their owners had abandoned them centuries before. One chamber revealed rows of stone molds used in the shaping of decorative metalwork. Another contained shelves of records so old that many crumbled at the slightest touch. Ori spent days preserving whatever could still be read. Sometimes he emerged from forgotten archives looking as though he had discovered buried treasure. In a sense, he had. History. One afternoon, he arrived breathless in the 21st hall. Balin looked up from a map. What now? Ori held up a fragile scroll. A list. A list of what? Kings. Balin blinked. What? A genealogy. The younger dwarf carefully unrolled the document. Names filled the faded parchment. Generations of rulers, line after line stretching back into the distant past. Balin stared at it silently. Each name represented a life, a reign, a chapter of history. Many had been forgotten outside scholarly circles. Yet here they remained, waiting in darkness all these years, waiting to be remembered. That evening, the scroll was displayed in the hall. Dwarves gathered around it late into the night, reading, discussing, arguing over ancient dates, sharing stories passed down through their families. The discovery strengthened something already growing within the colony, a sense of belonging, a sense that they were not intruders, not visitors, not trespassers. They were returning to a home unjustly taken from them. As summer deepened, further successes followed. New halls were secured. Ancient cisterns were cleaned and reopened. A forgotten smithy was restored to working condition. One scouting party even discovered signs of mithril-bearing rock. The news spread like wildfire. Excitement swept through the colony. Though no significant deposits had yet been reached, the discovery alone seemed to validate every sacrifice, every risk, every mile traveled. That night the celebrations lasted for hours. Songs echoed through the 21st hall. Ale flowed freely. Stories grew steadily less accurate with each passing mug. Even Balin allowed himself to relax. He sat among his companions and listened as laughter rolled through the chamber. For the first time in many years, he felt something he had scarcely dared believe possible. Contentment, not hope, not ambition. Contentment. The dream was becoming reality. Late that evening, after many others had retired, Balin wandered alone through the hall. The great silver lamp given to him by Dane still burned near the center of the chamber. Its flame had become a symbol of the colony, a reminder of where they had begun, a reminder of why they had come. He stood before it for a long time. The vast hall stretched away into darkness beyond the pools of lamplight. Stone pillars rose like giant trees around him. Somewhere far off he could hear faint voices. The distant sound of work continuing even at this late hour. The mountain no longer felt dead. It felt awake. Balin smiled. Then he continued his walk. His path eventually led him to one of the upper galleries overlooking the 21st hall. From there, he could see much of the colony below. Lanterns glowed warmly. Dwarves moved between workshops. Guards patrolled their assigned routes. Smoke drifted upward from cooking fires. The sight filled him with pride. Years ago, this hall had been silent. Now it lived again. A voice spoke behind him. "You look pleased." Balin turned. Oin stood nearby. The old healer carried a lantern in one hand. "I am pleased. You are thinking dangerous thoughts." Balin laughed. "What sort of dangerous thoughts?" "The sort that begin with the words, 'Perhaps we have succeeded.'" The older dwarf considered this, then nodded. Perhaps. Oin leaned against the stone railing. For a while they looked out over the hall together. At length, the healer spoke again. You know, when we first entered this place, I expected trouble immediately. So did I. But nothing happened. Balin frowned slightly. Nothing happened. The words lingered. There was truth in them. Weeks had become months. Months had become nearly a year. And still no serious threat had emerged. The silence that once seemed ominous now felt reassuring. Normal. Expected. Perhaps that was dangerous. Perhaps not. Eventually Oin yawned. Well, if doom intends to arrive, it is taking its time. Balin smiled. Perhaps doom has gone elsewhere. I hope so. The healer departed, leaving Balin alone with his thoughts. Far below, the colony continued its work. The sight brought warmth to his heart. Yet for reasons he could not explain, a small unease remained. Not fear, not exactly, more a feeling, a sensation difficult to define, as though the mountain contained depths still untouched by light, as though somewhere beyond their maps and lanterns, unseen corridors stretched into darkness, watching, waiting. The feeling passed quickly. Balin dismissed it. There was no evidence to support such worries, only imagination, and imagination often grows strongest in old age. The following weeks brought more reasons for optimism. Additional messengers arrived from Erebor. New supplies followed. A small number of fresh settlers joined the colony. Their arrival was greeted enthusiastically. Every new dwarf represented growth, strength, confidence. One evening, a feast was held in their honor. The 21st hall echoed with music. Tables overflowed with food. Stories were shared. Toasts were raised. During the celebrations, Floy stood upon a bench and lifted his mug high. To Balin. Cheers erupted. Balin immediately looked uncomfortable. Floy ignored this. To the First Lord of Moria in generations. The hall fell silent. The title hung in the air. Lord of Moria. Several dwarves exchanged glances. Then one began clapping. Another followed. Soon the entire hall joined in. Balin rose slowly. His face flushed beneath his beard. I am no king. No, shouted someone. You are worse. Laughter followed. Balin waited until the noise settled. Then he raised his own mug. If I am lord of anything, it belongs to all of us. A murmur of approval spread through the hall. We came together. He looked around the chamber, at the faces illuminated by firelight, at friends old and new, at the growing community around him. We built this together. More nods, more smiles. Balin lifted his mug higher. And one day, perhaps, others will look upon these halls and remember this night as the beginning. The dwarves roared their approval. Ale splashed. Songs resumed. Hope filled the hall, bright, warm, certain. And far below them, beyond the deepest maps, beyond forgotten mines, beyond ancient shafts descending into the roots of the mountains, something stirred, a faint movement, a distant awakening, a whisper of ancient malice. It passed quickly, barely noticeable, like a sleeper turning in uneasy dreams. No dwarf heard it, no dwarf saw it, no dwarf knew that the first shadow had begun to move. For now, Moria belonged to Hope, and Hope, shining brightly beneath the mountain, made it difficult to see the darkness gathering beyond the reach of its light. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Deep. For nearly 2 years, fortune seemed to favour Balin's colony. The 21st Hall continued to thrive. More chambers were reclaimed. More workshops reopened. Scouts pushed further into regions of Moria that had not known the light of a lantern for centuries. Trade routes to Erebor remained difficult, but dependable. Supplies arrived. Messages flowed east and west. New dwarves joined the settlement. To many, it seemed that the impossible had been achieved. Khazad-dûm was returning to life. The confidence of the colony grew with every passing month. Where once the dwarves had moved cautiously through unfamiliar halls, they now walked with purpose. Routes were well known. Patrols followed established paths. Storehouses filled steadily. New maps covered the walls of the 21st Hall, showing an ever-expanding network of explored passages. The mountain felt less like a ruin and more like a kingdom. It was during the 3rd year that the first unease returned. At first, nobody considered it important. A scouting party returned later than expected. That happened occasionally. A collapsed passage delayed them. Nothing more. Several weeks later, another patrol reported hearing distant sounds while exploring the western reaches. Not voices, not footsteps, simply sounds, faint echoes, the sort of noises one often hears in mountains. Stone shifting, water moving, perhaps nothing at all. The report was noted and quickly forgotten. Life continued. Work continued. The dream continued. Then came the first disappearance. The dwarf was named Bori, a miner, experienced, reliable. He had been working alongside 3 others in a newly explored section of the lower halls. When the shift ended, the others returned. Bori did not. A search began immediately. The passage was examined. The surrounding chambers were explored. Tracks were sought. No trace of him could be found. It was as though he had simply vanished. For several days, the colony spoke of little else. Search parties ventured repeatedly into the area. Nothing. No body. No signs of struggle. No clues. Eventually, an explanation was agreed upon. A hidden shaft. A collapse. An accident. Moria was ancient and dangerous. Such things were unfortunate but not surprising. Life moved forward once more. Yet a small crack had appeared in the confidence of the colony. And cracks, however small, have a tendency to widen. Months later, another incident occurred. This time, it involved a patrol exploring a distant section of the northern passages. The dwarves returned unsettled. Balin questioned them personally. "What did you see?" The patrol leader hesitated, then shrugged. "We're not entirely certain." Balin frowned. "Try." The dwarf rubbed his beard. It was a light. A lantern. No. A torch? No. The dwarf seemed frustrated by his own uncertainty. It moved. Where? Far away. How far? The patrol leader pointed vaguely into the darkness beyond the hall. Very far. The explanation did little to satisfy anyone. No evidence supported the claim. No further sightings followed. Yet whispers began to spread. Quiet conversations, speculation, questions. Were there others in Moria? Had they overlooked something? Were they truly alone? Balin attempted to dismiss such fears. Publicly, he remained confident. Privately, he found himself studying maps more often, reviewing reports more carefully, listening more closely whenever scouts returned from distant regions. One evening, He stood with Ori in a newly discovered archive chamber. Dust covered everything. Ancient shelves lined the walls. Many had collapsed. Others remained intact. Thousands of records had once been stored here. Most had long since perished. Ori carefully examined the weathered document beneath lantern light. "What have you found?" Balin asked. The younger dwarf looked up. "Warnings." Balin stepped closer. "Warnings?" Ori nodded. "Old mining records." He carefully turned the parchment. "The deeper workings." "What about them?" Ori hesitated, then read aloud. "Certain lower passages are to remain sealed by order of the King's Council." Balin frowned. "Why?" Ori continued searching. Several moments passed. Then he found another line. "No excavation is to continue beyond the 7th level beneath Barazinbar." Silence followed. "Does it explain why?" Balin asked. "No." "Nothing?" Ori shook his head. "Only instructions." The discovery troubled them more than either wished to admit, not because it revealed danger, but because it revealed ignorance. The dwarves who had built Khazad-dûm had known far more about the mountain than Balin's colony ever could, and apparently some knowledge had been lost. Over the following months, additional fragments emerged. References to sealed passages, mentions of abandoned workings, warnings regarding certain lower levels. None explained themselves fully. The records were frustratingly incomplete. Many had been damaged. Others were missing entirely. Still, a pattern was beginning to emerge. The ancient dwarves had avoided certain places. The question was why. One night, as rain fell upon the mountains above, Balin sat with Oin beside a small fire. The healer listened quietly as Balin described the records. When he finished, Oin poked thoughtfully at the flames. "You are worried." "A little." "About old records? About what they do not say?" Oin nodded slowly. "Aye." For a while neither spoke. Then the healer shrugged. Perhaps they feared collapses. Perhaps. Poisonous gas. Perhaps. Flooding. Perhaps. Oin smiled. "You dislike uncertainty. So do you." The old dwarf laughed. True. Yet neither seemed reassured. The mountain itself appeared unchanged. The colony remained successful. No enemies had appeared. No attacks had occurred. No immediate threat presented itself. And yet, something felt different, subtle, difficult to define. The feeling grew stronger after the drums. The first time they were heard, nobody believed the report. A small patrol returned from the western reaches, carrying news that sounded absurd. Drums. Distant drums. Balin questioned each member separately. All described the same thing. A faint rhythmic sound, far away, almost impossible to hear. The reports matched perfectly, yet the explanation remained elusive. "What kind of drums?" Balin asked. The patrol leader frowned. "I don't know." "War drums?" "Perhaps. Could it have been falling stone?" The dwarf shook his head. "No." "What makes you certain?" The answer came immediately. "Stone doesn't keep rhythm." The words lingered in Balin's mind long after the meeting ended. Stone doesn't keep rhythm. Additional patrols were sent. None heard anything. The incident might have been forgotten, except that 2 months later, another group reported the same sound. And then another. Always distant, always faint, always deep within unexplored regions of Moria. Boom, silence. Boom, silence. Boom. Never close, never approaching, always somewhere beyond reach. Some dwarves dismissed the reports entirely. Others did not. Floy laughed whenever the subject arose. Perhaps the mountain is singing. Yet even he stopped joking when experienced scouts began hearing the same thing. By the 4th year, optimism remained strong, but unease had become impossible to ignore. The colony still prospered. Trade continued. Workshops expanded. Additional halls were reclaimed. Yet something had changed. The mountain no longer felt entirely empty. One afternoon, a scouting party returned from the lower levels carrying troubling news. Tracks. Not dwarf tracks. Not recent. But unmistakable. Orc tracks. The discovery caused immediate concern. Balin personally inspected the evidence. There could be no mistake. The prints were old, several weeks old at least, perhaps older, yet they were genuine. The orcs had been there, somewhere within Moria, watching, moving, surviving. The revelation changed everything. Not dramatically, not immediately, but subtly. Guards became more alert. Patrols increased. Scouts traveled in larger groups. Weapons were inspected more frequently. Conversations grew quieter. The colony had spent years believing itself alone. Now that certainty was gone. One evening, Balin climbed to a high gallery overlooking the 21st hall. The silver lamp still burned at its center. Below him, dwarves continued their work. They laughed. They argued. They shared meals. Life remained good. Yet for the first time in many years, Balin felt a familiar sensation returning. Doubt, not regret, never regret, but doubt. Had they become too comfortable, too confident? Had success blinded them to dangers still hidden within the mountain? He thought of dying. He thought of the warning given beside the fire in Erebor. The darkness seemed alive. At the time, those words had felt distant, ancient, almost irrelevant. Now they returned with unexpected force. Balin stood silently for a long while. Then he descended from the gallery and summoned the leaders of the colony. When they gathered, he spoke plainly. "We continue our work." Heads nodded. "We continue our exploration." More nods. "We continue reclaiming Khazad-dûm." Agreement filled the room. Then Balin's expression hardened. "But from this day forward, nobody travels alone." The mood changed immediately. No exceptions. Silence. No assumptions. More silence. No carelessness. The gathered dwarves exchanged uneasy glances. Balin looked around the room. "We have achieved much." His voice softened. "More than many believed possible." Several smiled. Then his expression darkened once more. "But we must remember where we are." Nobody argued, because every dwarf in the room understood the truth. They had built a colony. They had reclaimed halls. They had relit ancient lamps. But they had not conquered Moria. Not truly. Most of the mountain still lay beyond their reach, still buried beneath darkness, still unexplored. And somewhere within those endless depths, something was moving. Something was watching. Something was beginning to awaken, though none yet understood just how ancient or how terrible that awakening would prove to be. Chapter 6. The Kingdom Awakens. The 5th year of Balin's rule began with celebration. Few among the colony realized it at the time, but they were living through the brightest days they would ever know beneath the mountains. The 21st Hall had become a thriving center of activity. Lanterns burned throughout the chamber both day and night. Workshops operated continuously. New halls had been reclaimed and linked by secure routes. Ancient stairways, once choked with rubble, now carried regular traffic. What had begun as a bold expedition had become something far greater, a kingdom, not yet the mighty Khazad-dûm of old, not yet the endless realm sung of in ancient lays, but undeniably a kingdom. Visitors arriving from Erebor often stood speechless when they first entered the 21st Hall. Many expected ruins. Instead, they found life. The ring of hammers echoed through the chamber. Stonecutters worked beneath towering pillars. Merchants exchanged goods. Guards patrolled well-maintained routes. Children of newly arrived families played between workshops while their parents watched from nearby benches. That sight above all others filled Balin with pride. Children. For the first time in centuries, dwarf children lived once more within Moria. One evening, Balin stood beside the great silver lamp that still burned at the center of the hall. Its flame had become a symbol of the colony. No dwarf could remember a single day when it had been extinguished. Nearby, a group of youngsters chased one another around a stone pillar. Their laughter echoed through the chamber. Balin watched them quietly. For a moment he imagined another age, a greater age, a time when thousands of such voices had filled these halls. Perhaps, he thought, those days might come again. Perhaps not in his lifetime. Perhaps not even in the lifetime of those children. But someday, the thought warmed him. Balin. The voice came from above. Floy was descending a staircase at remarkable speed for a dwarf of his size. He arrived slightly out of breath. "We found another forge." Balin smiled. "Still standing?" "Barely." "Useful?" "Very." The two dwarves set off immediately. Such discoveries had become increasingly common. Every month seemed to reveal another fragment of ancient Khazad-dûm, a forgotten workshop, a hidden archive, a sealed storeroom. Sometimes they contained little of value. Other times they yielded treasures beyond measure. Not gold, not jewels. Knowledge, history, memory, the true wealth of a lost kingdom. Several days later, Ori emerged from one such archive carrying a stack of weathered records. His face wore the expression everyone had come to recognize, the expression that meant he had found something exciting. "What is it this time?" asked Oin. Ori carefully placed the documents upon a table. "Trade records." The healer blinked. "Trade records?" "From the reign of Durin VI." Oin frowned. "You look far too excited about trade records. You haven't seen them." The younger dwarf unrolled one parchment. Line after line of carefully maintained accounts filled the page. Numbers, names, inventories. At first glance, they appeared unremarkable. Then Ori pointed to the totals. The room fell silent. The scale was astonishing. Entire mines producing wealth beyond imagination. Caravans moving through the kingdom in numbers that seemed impossible. Workshops employing hundreds of craftsmen. Markets serving thousands. The records provided a glimpse of Khazad-dûm at the height of its power. Even Balin stared in amazement. For all the stories he had heard throughout his life, the reality exceeded them. "This," Ori said quietly, "is what we lost." No one spoke, because for the first time, they truly understood. Not just the grandeur, not just the wealth, but the scale, the sheer scale of the kingdom they hoped to restore. And yet, as the months passed, the drums continued, always distant, always faint, always somewhere beyond the reach of light. Boom, silence, boom, silence, boom. Sometimes weeks would pass without a report. Then another patrol would hear them. The sound never came closer, yet it never disappeared, like a heartbeat hidden deep within the mountain, waiting, listening, remembering. And though life in Moria had never seemed brighter, the shadows beyond the lantern light were growing restless. Chapter 7. The Gathering Shadow. The first snow of winter fell upon the peaks above Moria during the 6th year of Balin's rule. Far above the mountain, cold winds swept across the Misty Mountains and covered the high passes in white. Yet deep beneath the stone, life continued much as it always had. The forges burned. The workshops echoed with labor. Lanterns illuminated the 21st hall. Children played. Meals were shared. Songs were sung. To an outsider, the colony appeared strong, prosperous, secure. Yet beneath the surface, subtle changes had begun. Changes that few noticed at first. Changes that would prove impossible to ignore before long. The drums continued, always distant, always hidden, always beyond reach. Boom, silence. Boom, silence, boom. The sound never approached, yet it never vanished. Patrols heard it, scouts heard it. Even experienced miners occasionally reported faint echoes emerging from unexplored passages. No one could determine their source. Several expeditions attempted to locate them. All failed. The deeper regions of Moria remained a maze beyond comprehension. Ancient tunnels branched into forgotten levels. Collapsed passages blocked routes shown on old maps. Entire districts of the kingdom remained unexplored. The drums belonged somewhere within that darkness, but where exactly, nobody knew. One evening, Balin sat with Ori in the great archive chamber. The younger dwarf had become one of the foremost experts on Moria's surviving records. Years spent recovering damaged documents had transformed him into a living library. Scrolls covered the table before him. Ancient maps, mining reports, council records. Balin studied one particularly faded document. What does this refer to? Ori leaned forward. His expression darkened slightly. The lower workings, the same ones mentioned before. Ori nodded. Balin traced a line upon the map. The route descended far below any level yet explored by the colony. Do we know what happened there? Not precisely. Still no explanation. None. Ori sat back thoughtfully. That may be the most troubling part. Balin raised an eyebrow. The absence of information? Exactly. The younger dwarf tapped the parchment. Dwarves record everything. He gestured toward the surrounding shelves. Every shipment, every tunnel, every repair, every council meeting. Balin nodded. It was true. Dwarves were meticulous record keepers. What worries me, Ori continued, is that someone deliberately stopped recording certain things. The words lingered between them. Neither dwarf liked the implication. Someone had known something, and had chosen not to write it down. Weeks later, troubling news arrived from the Eastern Road. The messenger entered the 21st hall, looking exhausted. His cloak was torn. His beard carried traces of dried blood. The sight immediately drew attention. Balin personally escorted him to a private chamber. What happened? The messenger drank deeply before answering. Orcs. The word struck like a hammer. How many? I don't know. Where? 3 days east of Dimril Dale. Silence followed. The road between Moria and Erebor had remained relatively safe for years. Occasional dangers existed, of course. Wolves, bandits, the remnants of wandering goblin tribes. But organized orc activity was another matter entirely. They attacked at night, the messenger continued. We drove them off, but 2 dwarves were killed. Balin's face hardened. Were they from the mountains? I think so. The answer troubled him greatly. Within days, additional reports arrived. Not attacks, sightings, tracks, campfires. Scouts observing movement among distant ridges. Individually, none of the incidents seemed alarming. Together, they painted a different picture. The orcs were becoming active again. The question was why. Floyd dismissed the concerns initially. Orcs exist. Balin frowned. An insightful observation. They always existed. True. So why panic now? It was a fair question. Unfortunately, nobody possessed a satisfying answer. For a time, life continued much as before. Yet a subtle tension had entered the colony. Weapons were inspected more frequently. Guard patrols increased. Scouting parties grew larger. The changes were sensible, reasonable, necessary. Still, they represented a shift. The easy confidence of earlier years had begun to fade. One morning, a patrol failed to return. At first, no one worried. Delays happened. Routes through Moria remained difficult. Collapsed passages occasionally forced lengthy detours. But when a full day passed without word, concern began to spread. A search party was dispatched. They found the patrol 2 days later. 3 dwarves returned. The 4th did not. The survivors looked shaken. What happened? Balin asked the question himself. The patrol leader hesitated, then answered quietly. We were attacked. The room fell silent. Orcs? The dwarf nodded. How many? Not many. Balin frowned. Then why didn't you fight? The patrol leader looked away. We never saw them. A chill settled over the room. What do you mean? The answer came slowly. They followed us. Followed. For hours. The dwarf swallowed. We could hear them. How many? I don't know. Did they attack? No. Then what happened? The patrol leader's face grew pale. Rowan vanished. The missing dwarf. Balin's expression darkened. Vanished. He was walking beside me. Silence. We rounded a corner. The dwarf's voice trembled slightly. He was gone. The story sounded impossible. Yet every surviving patrol member told the same tale. The details matched perfectly. Rowan had disappeared. No body had been found. No evidence remained. Nothing. The incident unsettled the colony deeply. The mountain no longer felt empty, nor did it feel fully known. Dark corners seemed darker. Long corridors seemed longer. The vastness of Moria, once inspiring, now occasionally felt oppressive. One evening, Balin climbed alone to a high balcony overlooking the 21st hall. Below him, life continued. Lanterns glowed, voices echoed, Workshops remained busy. The kingdom still lived. Yet something had changed. He could feel it. The mountain felt watchful. The sensation reminded him of Dain's warning all those years ago. The darkness seemed alive. At the time, Balin had dismissed the concern. Now he found himself remembering every word. The following month brought another blow. A messenger from Erebor failed to arrive. Then another, then a third. The route east remained open, but it was no longer secure. Travel became increasingly dangerous. Trade slowed. Communication became irregular. For the first time since the colony's founding, isolation began to threaten them. The realization struck harder than any attack. Moria had always been far from help. Now help felt even further away. One night, during a council meeting, the subject finally arose openly. We may need to reduce exploration. The suggestion came from one of the senior scouts. Immediately, objections followed. Reduce exploration? We need more information, not less. We need security. We need progress. Arguments filled the chamber. Balin listened quietly. Eventually he raised a hand. Silence returned. The old dwarf looked around the room, at friends who had followed him across Middle-earth, at companions who had built this colony from dust and hope. Many appeared older now, wearier, concerned. The sight pained him. We continue. Several dwarves nodded, but carefully. More nods. We hold what we have reclaimed. Agreement spread through the chamber. We strengthen our defenses. Again agreement. Then Balin paused. The next words felt heavier. We prepare for the possibility that we are not alone. No one argued, because by now everyone understood. The question was no longer whether enemies existed within Moria. The question was how many, and where. As winter deepened, additional signs appeared. Orc tracks, distant lights, strange sounds, missing supplies. Nothing decisive, nothing dramatic. Yet together they formed a pattern. A shadow was gathering, slowly, patiently, methodically. The final warning arrived late one evening. A scout stumbled into the 21st hall just before midnight. His armor was damaged. His face was pale. Blood stained one sleeve. Balin reached him before anyone else. What happened? The scout struggled to catch his breath. Then he spoke 4 words. 4 simple words. Yet those words changed everything. We found the orcs. Silence spread across the hall. Every dwarf listening felt the same thing. A sudden coldness. The scout looked around the gathered faces. His voice dropped to a whisper. There are far more than we thought. No one slept well that night. For beyond the lantern light, beyond the reclaimed halls, beyond the maps and patrol routes, the darkness was no longer merely watching. It was gathering. And for the first time since entering Moria, Balin began to fear that the mountain itself was preparing for war. Chapter 8. The Fall of Balin. After the scout's warning, Moria changed. Not all at once. There was no single trumpet blast that announced the end of peace. No army appeared at the gates. No great battle erupted in the 21st hall. For a time, life continued with a strange and uneasy normality. The forges still burned. The workshop still rang with labor. Food was still prepared. Guards still changed the watch. Children still ran between pillars, though their parents now called them back more quickly than before. Yet something had altered. A weight had settled over the colony. The laughter was quieter. The songs ended sooner. Dwarves, who who had once walked confidently through long corridors now glanced into side passages as they passed. Lanterns were checked twice. Doors were barred at night. Patrols returned with drawn faces and fewer jokes. Maps that had once symbolized discovery now became maps of risk, marked with signs showing danger, uncertainty, and loss. The orcs were not scattered bands, as some had hoped. They were many, far more than expected. They moved through the hidden places of Moria like vermin beneath floorboards, unseen until they wished to be seen. They knew routes the dwarves had not discovered. They passed through cracks and shafts too narrow or forgotten for the settlers to guard. They appeared suddenly in distant corridors, loosed arrows from darkness, then vanished before pursuit could reach them. Balin responded as wisely as he could. Exploration was reduced. Outer passages were sealed. Barricades were built. Watch posts were strengthened. The 21st Hall, once open and welcoming, became a fortress of lamplight surrounded by shadow. Still, he refused to abandon hope. "We have not come this far to flee at the first sign of teeth," he told the council. No one argued, not because they were certain, but because they wanted to believe him, for Balin remained the heart of the colony. When he walked the halls, courage returned to those who saw him. When he spoke, fear seemed smaller. His beard was whiter now, and he leaned a little more heavily upon his staff during long councils, but his eyes remained bright. To many of the younger dwarves, he had become more than a leader. He had become the living proof that the dream was still possible. If Balin believed Moria could endure, then perhaps it could. Yet Balin himself was not blind. He saw the danger. He felt it growing. Each week brought new reports. A supply room discovered broken open. A sentry wounded by an unseen arrow. A patrol delayed by collapsed stone that had not collapsed naturally. A faint red light seen in the lower deeps. Drums. Always the drums. Boom. Silence. Boom. Silence. Boom. Sometimes they were so faint that one could almost dismiss them as imagination. Sometimes they were clear enough to stop conversation in a room. Then everyone would fall silent, listening, waiting, counting the spaces between each distant beat. No one ever said aloud what many had begun to fear, that the drums were not a warning, they were a summons. In those days, Balin often walked alone when his duties allowed, not far, never without guards nearby, but far enough to think. He would pass through the secured galleries, down repaired stairways, across chambers where lamps burned in iron brackets, newly fixed to ancient walls. He liked to visit the places where their work had begun. The first cleared corridor, the first restored forge, the first storehouse opened after centuries of dust. Most often, however, he returned to the Mirrormere, Keled Zaram, the sacred lake outside the East Gate. It remained, for him, the most peaceful place in all the valley. Even as Moria grew more troubled, the lake seemed unchanged. Its waters lay dark and still beneath the sky. The mountains reflected upon its surface with such clarity that they appeared to descend forever into another world. Balin found comfort there. He did not go because he was careless. He went because even leaders need places where they may lay down the weight of command for a little while. Usually 2 guards accompanied him, sometimes 3. The walk was short. The East Gate remained strongly held. The valley was watched. No serious attack had yet come from outside. The danger, they believed, lay within. One cold morning, as autumn faded toward winter, Balin rose earlier than usual. The colony still slept in patches of lamplight. A few workers were already awake. A guard nodded as Balin passed. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck metal, slow and measured. He wrapped his cloak around his shoulders and took up his staff. At the center of the 21st hall, 9 silver lamps still burned. Balin paused before it. The flame was steady. He stood there for a moment, watching its light ripple across the polished metal. Then he turned toward the eastern passage. Ori saw him go. The younger dwarf was seated at a table with several records spread before him. He looked tired. Most of them looked tired now. Ink stained his fingers, and a candle had burned low beside his hand. "You are walking early," Ori said. Balin smiled. "Old bones wake before young ones." "That is not what Oin says. Oin complains even in his sleep." Ori laughed softly, then glanced toward the passage. "Shall I send guards?" "They are already waiting." "Good." Ori hesitated. Then he said, "Be careful." Balin looked back at him. It was such a small phrase, a common phrase. Yet in those days it carried more meaning than it once had. "I will," Balin said. Then he left. The eastern ways were quiet. His guards walked behind him. Broin and Na, both steady dwarves, who had served the colony from its earliest days. They passed beneath arches carved by forgotten hands. They moved through halls where dust had once lain thick, now cleared by labor and marked by signs of occupation. Yet even here, close to the gate, shadows lingered in corners where the lamps did not quite reach. At the east gate, the morning waited grey and still. The sky above Dimrul Dale was pale. Low cloud clung to the mountains. Frost silvered the stones. The air smelled of cold water, rock, and distant snow. Balin stepped outside. For a moment, he closed his eyes. After so long beneath the mountain, even a dim morning felt bright. The Mirrormere lay below, calm as ever. They descended carefully toward the shore. No birds called, no wind moved. The whole valley seemed to be holding its breath. When they reached the lake, Balin walked a little ahead of his guards and stood beside the water. The surface was dark, perfectly still. He could see the mountains reflected there, and beyond them, faintly, the pale sky. He thought of Durin the Deathless. He thought of the first awakening. He thought of the crown of stars said to have shone in the water above Durin's head. He wondered what Durin would think of them now. A small company of exiles and dreamers, trying to restore a kingdom too vast for their strength. Would he honor them? Would he pity them? Would he call them fools? Balin smiled sadly. "Perhaps all three," he murmured. Behind him, Na shifted. "My lord." "Nothing." Balin lowered himself slowly to one knee and touched the water. It was bitterly cold. The chill ran into his fingers and up his arm, sharp enough to make him breathe in. Yet he did not pull away at once. For a brief moment, the cold steadied him. He was tired. More tired than he allowed others to see. The burden of hope was heavier than fear. Fear could be fought. Hope had to be carried. He thought of Dane in Erebor. He wondered whether the king had received their last message. He wondered whether more aid could be sent. He wondered whether he had mistaken courage for pride. The thought pained him. Then he dismissed it. Not because it was impossible, but because there was work still to do. He rose. At that same moment, a sound broke the stillness. A sharp hiss, Then another. Na cried out. An arrow struck him beneath the collar of his mail. He fell hard upon the stones. Broin shouted and raised his shield. Orcs. They came from the rocks above the shore. Not many. 6, perhaps 8. But they had chosen their place well. Arrows fell from cover. Broin moved in front of Balin just as another shaft struck his shield and snapped. Balin drew his sword. The blade shone pale in the morning light. For all his age, his hand was steady. The first orc came leaping down with a curved blade in its fist. Balin met it with a stroke that split helm and skull together. The creature collapsed at his feet. Broin charged another and drove it back against a stone. For a moment, it seemed they might cut their way free. Then more arrows flew. Broin staggered. One had found the gap beneath his arm. He roared, struck down the orc before him, and fell beside it. Balin stood alone. The lake lay behind him. The rocks before him crawled with enemies. He lifted his sword in both hands. The orcs hesitated. Perhaps they had expected an old dwarf to fall quickly. Perhaps some memory of Durin's folk still stirred fear in their rotten hearts. Balin used that hesitation. He moved faster than they expected. His sword took one in the throat. His shoulder struck another and sent it stumbling. An arrow grazed his cheek. Another tore through his cloak. He fought as he had fought in younger days, not with the wild strength of youth, but with skill, discipline, and the deep stubbornness of a dwarf who had seen too much of war to fear its noise. Yet age is age, and numbers are numbers. A black-feathered arrow flew from somewhere above. It struck him low in the side. Balin gasped. His knees buckled. Still he did not fall. He drove his sword point first into the ground and leaned upon it. The orcs closed in. Their eyes glittered. Their blades were drawn. Balin looked past them, beyond the rocks, beyond the broken gate, toward the dark opening of Khazad-dûm. For a moment, he did not see ruin. He saw lamps, pillars, children laughing, hammers ringing, the 21st hall alive with song. He saw Dain's silver lamp burning in the darkness. He saw the dream, not as folly, not as failure, but as something beautiful, something worth having tried. His lips moved. No one heard the words clearly. Perhaps he spoke the name of Durin. Perhaps he spoke the name of his father. Perhaps he simply said home. Then a final arrow struck. Balin, son of Fundin, fell beside the Miramir. The water did not move. The mountains remained reflected in its surface, and the valley was silent once more. The alarm reached Moria before midday. A gate guard heard movement beyond the lower path and discovered Na, still alive, dragging himself toward the entrance. Blood marked the stones behind him. His face was grey with pain. "Orcs," he whispered. Then, with the last of his strength, "Balin." The response was immediate. A war party formed within moments. Floy led them, his face terrible with anger. Oin followed despite protests, carrying medicines he already feared would be useless. Ori came too, though no one asked him. He carried no book this time, only an axe. They found Broin first, then the orcs. Most had fled. 2 remained near the water, perhaps searching the bodies. Floy killed one before it could turn. The second tried to run. It did not get far. Then they found Balin. He lay upon the stones beside the lake, one hand still near the hilt of his sword. For a while, no one spoke. Even Floy, whose anger had burned white hot only moments before, stood silent. Oin knelt beside him. He placed 2 fingers against Balin's neck, then lowered his head. Ori felt something inside him give way, not loudly, not like a cry, more like a door closing in some deep place of the heart. Their lord was dead, the dreamer, the founder, the one who had led them home, dead beside the sacred water of their people. They carried him back slowly. No song was sung, no drum was beaten. Only the sound of boots on stone accompanied the procession. When they entered the east gate, word had already spread. The halls were filled with dwarves standing in silence. Some wept openly, others stood rigid, faces pale and unbelieving. Children were held close by their parents. The body of Balin was carried through the eastern passages and into the 21st hall. There, beneath the great pillars, they laid him before the silver lamp. Its flame shone upon his face. For the first time since its lighting, the lamp seemed small, terribly small. That night no work was done in Moria. No hammer rang. No songs were sung. The colony gathered in grief. Oin spoke first, though his voice trembled. Then Floy, then Ori. Others followed. They spoke of Balin's kindness, his courage, his stubbornness, his wisdom, his foolishness too, for dwarves honor the truth even in mourning. They spoke of Erebor, of the long road west, of the first sight of the east gate, of the lighting of the lamp, of the first song in the 21st hall. At last, Ori opened his journal. His hand shook. He wrote carefully, because he knew the words mattered. Balin, Lord of Moria, fell by orc arrows beside the Mirrormere. He stopped. The sentence blurred before him. He waited until his eyes cleared. Then he continued. We have slain many of them, but the loss is beyond all reckoning. In the days that followed, a tomb was prepared. They chose a chamber of honor near the 21st hall, strong and solemn, with walls of pale stone. Craftsmen worked without rest. The tomb was carved with care worthy of a king, though Balin had never claimed such a title for himself. Upon it they placed his name, Balin, son of Fundin, Lord of Moria. The words were simple. They were enough. When the tomb was sealed, the colony gathered once more. No one knew what should happen next. Some wished to abandon Moria immediately. Others demanded vengeance. Many simply stood in grief, unable to think beyond the loss. Floy wanted war. Oin wanted caution. Ori wanted time. But time, though desired by all, was the one thing the mountain would no longer give them. For Balin's death had changed more than the mood of the colony. It had revealed a truth none could ignore. The orcs were bold enough to strike outside the gate, bold enough to kill their lord beside the sacred lake, bold enough to test the strength of Moria itself. The dream had been wounded, deeply, perhaps mortally. Yet even then the dwarves did not leave. They had buried Balin beneath the mountain. To abandon Moria now felt like abandoning him. So they stayed. They tightened the defenses. They sent messengers east. They sharpened axes. They barred gates. They watched the dark. And from somewhere far below, as if in answer to their grief, the drums began again. Boom, silence, boom, silence, boom. This time they sounded closer. The death of Balin marked the beginning of the end. Though no dwarf spoke those words aloud, all felt their truth. The lamps still burned. The forges still glowed. The banners of Durin's folk still hung proudly from the pillars of the 21st hall. Yet something essential had departed from Moria sat beside the waters of the Miramir. For years, Balin had been more than a leader. He had been the dream itself. When others doubted, Balin believed. When others feared, Balin endured. When others looked upon the darkness of Khazad-dûm and saw only danger, Balin had seen home. Now he lay beneath stone, and the darkness seemed suddenly larger. The tomb prepared for him stood within the chamber of Mazabul. The finest craftsmen remaining in the colony labored day and night to complete it. Every line was cut with care. Every rune was carved with reverence. No dwarf complained of the work, no matter how tired he was. It was the last gift they could give him. When the stone lid was finally lowered into place, the chamber fell silent. Upon the tomb they carved Balin, son of Fundin, lord of Moria. No boast, no long inscription, no list of achievements, only the truth. It was enough. For a long time, the dwarves stood around the tomb without speaking. Some bowed their heads, others openly wept. Many simply stared, unable to imagine the halls without him. At last, Floy stepped forward. His face was hard. His eyes burned with grief and anger. They murdered him. The words echoed from the stone walls. They murdered our Lord. No one disagreed. Floy slammed a fist against the tomb. The sound rang through the chamber. They think this will break us. His voice grew louder. They think they can drive us from Khazad-dûm. Murmurs of agreement spread through the gathered dwarves. Many wanted revenge. Many wanted blood. Floy pointed toward the darkness beyond the chamber. Then let them learn what it means to provoke Durin's folk. A cheer answered him. Not a loud one, not the roar of confident warriors, but the desperate growl of wounded dwarves refusing to yield. Yet another voice soon rose against him. Oin, old, weary, still carrying more wisdom than most. If we rush into darkness seeking vengeance, he said, we will merely join Balin in death. The room fell silent. Floy turned. You would have us hide. I would have us survive. The two stared at one another. Both loved Balin. Both grieved him. Both wanted to honor him. Yet each saw a different path. And therein lay the tragedy. There were no good choices remaining, only bad ones, and worse ones. In the months that followed, the colony fought for its life. The attacks increased. Every week brought another assault. Every patrol returned with fewer dwarves. Every map showed more territory lost. The orcs were no longer hiding. They were gathering, bold, organized, patient. The darkness itself seemed to be pushing against the fragile island of light the dwarves had built. Outer passages were abandoned. Barricades were constructed. Watchfires burned constantly. No dwarf traveled alone. No door remained unguarded. And still the enemy came. One hall after another fell. One corridor after another was surrendered. The kingdom Balin had dreamed of restoring slowly shrank around them, like a flame starving for air. Ori continued writing. Every evening he sat beside Balin's tomb with his journal open across his knees. The great book had begun as a record of hope. Now it became something far more important. The memory of a dying kingdom. He wrote everything. The victories, the defeats, the names of the dead, the names of the living, the names of those still fighting. He feared that if he stopped writing, Moria itself would begin to disappear. One evening he recorded, "The drums continue. We hear them every day now. No one speaks of them any longer. We simply listen. The words seemed small against the vastness of the mountain. Yet he wrote them anyway, because stories matter most when darkness gathers. Then came the loss of the first hall. The battle lasted from dawn until deep into the night. Axes shattered, shields splintered. The stone floors ran slick with blood. Fra fell defending a staircase. 3 more dwarves died trying to recover his body. The survivors eventually retreated, exhausted, wounded, defeated. And still the drums continued. Boom, boom, boom. Closer now, always closer. The next disaster struck at the west gate. For years it had remained a possible escape. Dangerous, difficult, but possible. Then, in a single night, that hope vanished. The surviving guards stumbled back into Moria shortly before dawn. Their faces carried a terror unlike anything seen before. One collapsed before speaking. Another could barely stand. At last, their captain delivered the news. The gate is lost. Silence followed. The words struck harder than any weapon. For now there would be no escape, no retreat, no road home. Yet worse news followed. Something had emerged from the black water outside the gate. Something vast, something ancient. Tentacles, eyes, a shape older than memory. Dwarves had been dragged screaming beneath the surface before anyone could help them. Among them was Oin, the healer, the counselor, the last voice of caution, gone. The Watcher in the water had taken him. That night, Ori wrote only a single line. The Watcher took Oin. Nothing more needed to be said. The colony withdrew into the chamber of Mazabul. Balin's tomb stood there. Strong walls surrounded it. Narrow entrances could be defended. It would become their fortress, and though none wished to admit it, likely their grave. Food dwindled. Water was rationed. The wounded multiplied. Sleep became a luxury. Yet still the dwarves fought, because there was nowhere left to go, and because dwarves are stubborn creatures, even in defeat, especially in defeat. One by one, familiar faces vanished. Lonnie fell defending a barricade. Nali died beside him. Floy survived longer than anyone expected. For days he fought like a dwarf possessed, twice wounded, then 3 times, still refusing to retreat. At last, he fell upon the bridge, surrounded by orcs. The defenders watched him disappear beneath a sea of enemies. His final roar echoed through the hall long after he was gone. When the bridge was finally lost, many understood that the end was near. Only a handful remained. The company that had once marched proudly from Erebor was almost gone. The dreamers, the builders, the pioneers, reduced now to weary warriors defending a tomb. Then came the final night. No one needed to announce it. Everyone knew. The drums had never sounded louder. Boom, boom, boom. No pauses, no distance. The sound filled every corridor. The mountain itself seemed to pulse with it. Dust drifted continuously from the ceiling. Loose stones rattled across the floor. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though Moria itself were holding its breath. The surviving dwarves gathered around Balin's tomb. Lantern light flickered across tired faces. Axes were sharpened one final time. Shields were lifted. Mail adjusted. No speeches were made. There was no need. Every dwarf present knew exactly why he would fight. For Balin, for Khazad-dûm, for one another. Ori sat beside his journal. His hand trembled. The sounds of battle echoed from beyond the chamber. The final barricade was under attack. Wood cracked, iron screamed, orcs howled, dwarves answered. Slowly, he opened the book. He dipped his pen. Then he began to write. They have taken the bridge and the second hall. A tremendous impact shook the chamber. Dust fell onto the page. Ori continued. Frar and Loni and Nali fell there bravely, while the rest retreated to Mazarbul. The defenders shouted. Axes struck shields. Another crash followed. Closer now, much closer. Ori's breathing quickened. Still he wrote, "We cannot get out." The words looked final, terribly final. The end comes soon. A roar erupted beyond the door. The eastern barricade began to fail. Then Ori heard it. Not the drums, something else. A sound deeper than the drums. A sound that froze the blood in his veins. A distant roar, ancient, terrible, powerful beyond description. The sound rolled through the mountain itself. Several dwarves looked toward the darkness. Fear appeared on their faces. Real fear, not of orcs. Of something far worse, something older, something waking. Ori stared into the shadows. For one terrible moment he understood. Dain had been right. The darkness had never been empty. It had been waiting, waiting all along. The mountain trembled again. The roar echoed once more. Then the drums resumed. Boom, boom, boom. Closer than ever. Ori lowered his pen one final time and wrote the words that would survive long after all of them were gone. Drums. Drums in the deep. The eastern door exploded inward. The final barricade shattered. Dark figures poured through the gap. The surviving dwarves raised their weapons. Someone cried out the name of Durin. Another shouted Balin's name. Lanterns overturned. Shadows leapt across the walls. Steel flashed. The battle began. Ori looked once toward Balin's tomb. Then he set down the pen. The final line remained unfinished. The record ended. Years passed. The fires died. The lamps went out. Dust settled. Silence returned to Moria. Yet not forever. For many years later, another company would enter those dark halls. They would find Balin's tomb. They would find Ori's journal. And they would learn how a handful of dwarves had dared to challenge the darkness. They had failed. That much was true. Khazad-dûm remained lost. The colony perished. The dream was broken. And yet, for a little while, the lamps burned again. For a little while, songs echoed through the halls. For a little while, children laughed beneath the pillars of Durin's kingdom. For a little while, hope returned to Moria. And perhaps that was enough. For courage is not measured only by victory. Sometimes it is measured by the willingness to try. And though Balin's kingdom fell, the darkness never forgot that the dwarves had returned. For 5 brief years, Khazad-dûm lived again. And that, in the end, was Balin's triumph. The end.